In today's video, I'm going to be pointing out 6 beginner mistakes that will always ruin your photos and showing you what those mistakes are and how to not make those mistakes when taking wildlife photos. Now, all 6 of these are mistakes that I made starting out as a photographer, and some of them still occasionally make today. And they're all mistakes that I still see beginners making all the time. And, you know, they're things that when you can change and when you can fix and, you know, when you can stop making these mistakes, you're going to see great improvement in your photos with each and every mistake. Every time that you fix one of these problems, you're going to see improvement in your photos more and more and more until you're going from, you know, bad photos to great photos. So each of these mistakes is very important and are ones that I see all the time, and like I said, that I made myself, and that I can't wait to share with you guys and hope that you guys find helpful. So I'm jumping straight into it, guys. The very first one, and I feel like a broken record here, but the first one is going to be shooting above the animal. And the reason that I feel like a broken record saying that is because it's basically the opposite of the tip that I've given multiple times in multiple other videos to get low. You know, the mistake is to shoot above the animal. The proper way to do it, the way to fix this mistake, is to get low, to shoot from a low angle. And like I said, I see people doing this all the time. They shoot above the animal, and basically what happens when you shoot above the animal is that you pull the viewer out of the scene. You don't create an intimate moment with the animal. You don't make the viewer feel like they're in this moment with the animal. You instead kind of make them feel like they're looking at it from the outside. And to display this, I have a few photos here. As you can see in this photo here of these 2 grizzly bears, I took this in Yellowstone this summer. They're kind of down in this valley beneath me. And, you know, overall, it's just not the greatest photo. You've got these like trees running through it and all this. It's not a good photo by any means, but I'm just using it for, you know, showcase purposes here. The bears are below me, and they're way down in this valley. And because of that, it doesn't feel like I'm in the scene with these bears. Like this is a moment where I'm, you know, up close and personal and intimate with these bears. It feels like I'm watching from above and watching from the outside, which is, you know, kind of what I was doing. I was way above them. But what you want to create with wildlife photos is a scene that, you know, brings the viewer in and makes them feel like they're there with that animal. And that's not what you do when you shoot above like this. But as you can see, if you take a look at this photo of a grizzly bear that I also took in Yellowstone, a photo like this where I'm on eye level with this bear feels a lot more intimate. You feel more like you're in the scene and you're here with this bear and seeing him, you know, make his way across the landscape. And, you know, it's not super tight on the bear, just like the other photo wasn't very tight on the bears. But it doesn't have to be. As long as you're on eye level with that animal or a little bit below eye level, you're going to be able to create a nice intimate scene with that animal that really pulls the viewer in. And that's what, you know, has happened with a photo like this. And to go a little bit further, I'm going to showcase another photo that I'm going to come back to a little later in the video. And that is this grizzly bear photo. And as you can see in this one, what getting low also does, if you have, you know, like some trees in the background or some sagebrush up close in the foreground in this example, is it blurs that out. So what you do when you blur that out is that, you know, your viewer's eye is going to hit this, and because it's blurred out, they're going to go straight past it and hit the bear. And then instead of going beyond the bear into the trees, it's going to stay on the bear because the trees are all blurred out. Your eye is going to go directly to the bear, and it's going to stay on the bear because the bear is what's in focus in the frame. So getting low is going to put the animal further away from the background and, you know, put the foreground also closer to your lens and further away from the animal. And so it's going to blur those parts of the frame out and just put focus on that animal and really, you know, bring the viewer's eye into that animal. And before we get any farther in this video, guys, I do just want to briefly mention that I now have my website up and running. I've got a 2022 calendar up for sale over there. Link down below if you're interested, and let's get back to the video. So I know you guys have heard that tip from me multiple times if you've been watching my videos, and I apologize for that if you have, but you know, at this point, hopefully now you understand how important that is. So that's the first mistake that you need to fix. Get low, stop shooting from above the animal, and get on the animal's level. So the second mistake that we're going to talk about that I often see in beginners is shooting in harsh light. There are really only a few lighting conditions that are really even that relevant to wildlife photography. You have sunset and sunrise light. You have lighting on overcast days, overcast light, if you want to call it that. And you have harsh midday light. So harsh midday light is when there's no clouds in the sky and it's just the sun way up high, not near sunrise or sunset. Sunrise and sunset light, pretty explainable. Sun is low on the horizon and, you know, just coming up or just setting. And then overcast light is when you have, a nice layer of clouds blocking out the sun and really diffusing the light. And the one of those three conditions that you don't want to shoot in is harsh light, and that's a mistake that I see a lot of beginners making. So to showcase this, let me show you an example of a photo taken in harsh light. So this is a bighorn sheep that was taken a little bit too late after sunrise. This was almost sunrise. It was just a little bit too late, a little bit beyond the good light period of time in sunrise. And this was, just a little bit past that. So the light began to get harsh, and as you can see, that started to create these dark shadows, like right here. Just a really dark spot there, or on the leg down here, or even in the grass, in the background. You get these really dark spots back in here, in the background even, that end up really distracting the viewer in the photo, and end up just overall creating a bad look for the animal. Just, it doesn't look good in this kind of lighting. And the same thing applies for a photo like this. You can see this bear, this whole side of his face is like way blown out, way too white, and this whole side is way too dark. Just doesn't work when you have the sun high in the sky, and it creates these harsh shadows, and the light is hitting in a very harsh way on your subject. It just doesn't make for a good photo. It just creates these problems, these blown out areas, and these areas that are way too dark in your photo. And in the end, it just doesn't make for a good photo. You just can't really shoot that great of photos in harsh light most of the time. There are some cases where very skilled photographers can pull it off, but it's not an easy thing to do. So to give you some examples of some good lighting, here's a sunset photo that I took of a black bear in Great Smoky Mountains National Park back in April. And you can see in this case, the sun was low on the horizon, and it was hitting this bear from this angle sort of on the front. You can see what it did was it really created some definition in the bear. You can see like right in here, you've got this blue cast on this side, and it really helps show the contours in his head, and show that this head, create some definition in the head of the bear. On a two-dimensional image, you actually have a little bit of definition. Same thing right here. You can see where his body kind of curves back and dips in right here based on where the line between the blue and the golden light are here. So basically, when you shoot in this kind of lighting, you not only don't get those super harsh shadows and super bright white, harsh white areas like you see in this grizzly bear photo right here. You not only get to eliminate those when you shoot in these golden light conditions, because the light is so soft that it just doesn't create those. It doesn't create those terrible black shadows and bright whites. But you also, when you shoot in these settings, get a little bit of that definition that shows more than in harsh lighting, and ends up being a better photo overall. And then the other condition that you can shoot in, and I usually end up shooting in this one a lot, I guess just in Yellowstone it was like this a lot. We just didn't have that nice golden light a lot. But the other condition is overcast lighting. And the good thing about overcast lighting, as you can see with a photo like this, this was a grizzly bear photo that I took in Yellowstone. It was overcast, so there aren't any of those super, black sinks in the photo, and there aren't any blown out whites in the photo. You still don't get that definition like you get when you get good golden lighting like this. But even without that definition, you can still, in post-processing, use contrast sliders and highlights and shadows and blacks and whites and all that stuff to still create a little bit of definition in the animal, and still, create kind of this three-dimensional animal in the image. But you can only do that when you have overcast lighting. With harsh lighting, you have a lot harder of a time doing that. And so overcast lighting is going to allow you to shoot and take good photos without those harsh shadows and bright whites. And golden lighting isn't going to allow you to do that as well. And golden lighting is also going to allow you to create those shots with a lot of definition in your animal as well. So obviously those golden lighting times right after sunrise and right before sunset are going to be your ideal times. But overcast lighting is your second best lighting, and still, I've taken some of my favorite photos in overcast lighting. It's not by any means bad lighting. It's just not as good as golden lighting. And then the worst is harsh lighting. That is the mistake that beginners often make that you don't want to shoot in. You don't want to shoot in harsh lighting because it typically doesn't end up creating very good images. So that is the second mistake. And moving along here, I want to speed this up a little bit. Let's talk about the third one. And this is to use too low of a shutter speed when shooting. So what can happen is, you think that 1/250th of a second or 1/320th of a second is a fast enough shutter speed, because that's literally 1/320th of a second. That's a very, very short amount of time. But the thing is, with animals, they move very, very fast. A grizzly bear, for example, can run 35 miles an hour. That's fast. So even though you have a very fast shutter speed with 1/320th of a second, it may not be fast enough. And I'm going to showcase that. I don't really have any great examples of it, but I have a decent example of it here with this wolf that I photographed in Yellowstone. Harsh lighting. There you go, back to the harsh lighting thing. Obviously, I didn't really have a choice. This was midday when I saw this wolf, and they're so rare that I was going to shoot it either way, even though the lighting was bad. But you can see how it created some issues with the photo, with these dark spots here, and in his mouth and on the eyes. It just didn't work out well, and this is a perfect example of that again, but that's besides the point. The point of this is that, as you can see, I was shooting at 1/500th of a second, which is typically fast enough. But this wolf was moving pretty fast, and I actually ended up getting, and it's not evident like this, but when you zoom in, I ended up getting a little bit of motion blur on this guy. On the paw right down in here, you can see a little bit of motion blur in there. It's not bad. Like I said, I don't have a great example of this. Here's a little more on this paw. But I don't have a great example of this because I typically shoot with a fast enough shutter speed. I guess I need to purposely, take a photo with too low of a shutter speed, but it's very easy to do, and you end up getting motion blur in your photos, and that's not what you want. So it's not that you can't get sharp photos at lower shutter speeds. I mean, I've shot wildlife at 1/100th of a second and gotten sharp photos. But when the wildlife's in motion is when it really becomes a problem, and when you really need to bump that shutter speed up a lot more than you would think that you need to. The point is, it's really easy to shoot at too low of a shutter speed and very quickly ruin your images. So bump that shutter speed up a bit. If you're shooting below 1/400th right now, I would say you probably need to bump that up. Shoot at a 400th minimum, preferably, 1/640th, 1/800th, somewhere around that for animals in motion is going to be a lot better. And you're going to be sure that you're freezing that motion, and that, even you holding the camera and, moving around, you're going to be able to shoot and not get motion blur just from your movement, beyond the fact that, the animal is also in motion. Now, the next mistake that I often see beginners making is actually kind of tied into the last one, and it is being afraid to bump up your ISO. Obviously, we all know that when you raise your ISO, what happens is it introduces more grain in your photo. If you didn't know that, now you know it, and I actually have a tutorial talking all about ISO and shutter speed and all that. I'll link that up above. But basically what happens, for those of you that don't know, when you raise your ISO is that you introduce grain to the photo. You brighten up the photo, but you also introduce grain. So a lot of beginners end up being afraid to bump their ISO up because they don't want to introduce more grain and more noise into the photo. They want to have a nice photo with minimal noise. So then what they end up doing, and this is kind of how it ties into that last tip, is they lower their shutter speed so that they can also lower their ISO. That way they have a lower ISO and a cleaner photo. But what happens then is, like I showed you with the last one, you end up getting more motion blur. So these two mistakes tie into each other in a lot of ways because, you want to lower your shutter speed so that you can lower your ISO. But what you really need to end up doing is raising your shutter speed and raising your ISO. The mistake is lowering both of those. The way to fix it is to raise both of those, because even though, it does introduce more grain in your photo, most photographers will tell you that it's better off to have a sharp photo that's got a lot of noise than a blurry photo that has no noise. And I can display that with this image here. It's not by any means a great image, but as you can see, this is a grizzly bear in Yellowstone. And what happened here is it was getting very dark out. The sun had totally set by now. I lowered my shutter speed, as you can see here, all the way to 1/125th, which is way lower, like I said, than I typically want to shoot. And I guess I was falling to the beginner mistake here as well, but it didn't really introduce much motion blur. The bear was moving pretty slow, so I was able to pull it off. But as you can see, I had my ISO all the way up at 16,000, which is very high and obviously introduced a lot of grain in this photo, as you can see. I mean, this is really not even a usable photo, but this still looks better than if I lowered the ISO to maybe 10,000, say, and lowered my shutter speed down, and then had a bear with a blurry face, and this arm was blurred and in motion, and you couldn't even really tell that it was a bear. This looks better, even though it's noisy, than if I'd done that and reduced the noise, if you guys see what I'm getting at here. So the point is, raise your shutter speed and raise your ISO. Both of those mistakes go hand in hand, and even though you're going to introduce more noise in your photos, you're going to have sharper photos, which are, in the end, better photos. So that is the fourth mistake. And now moving on to the next one here. This is another one that I am sometimes guilty of. Typically in all these videos, I end up having a tip or a mistake that I'm guilty of messing up on. But this one is one that I was guilty of actually pretty recently with some of the bear photos I post-processed from Yellowstone. And you can see that with this image here, and that is over editing. Now I did exaggerate it a little bit for this example. This one wasn't this over edited, but it was over edited. And I didn't like the results, so I went in and re-edited it. But basically, with over editing, what you're doing is you get in Lightroom and you start using all these cool sliders and seeing what they do. And you know, you see this vibrant slider adds so much color to your photos, and saturation too, and you start playing with them and go a little overboard. And that's kind of what has happened in the example of this photo. I've added way too much vignette around the bear. You can just see it's just way too dark around him. And you know, I'll even introduce more saturation to show how you may over edit it. Saturation is a big one that you see very often, taking that saturation slider up way too much. Again, I'm guilty of it as well. But as you can see in a photo like this, it's just over edited. It just looks unrealistic. There's the sagebrush is really not this green. You know, the bear is not this purple, and the vignette is just way too heavy. It's way too dark around the bear, and the bear is way too bright in the center with way too dark of surroundings in this photo. It's just been way over edited. So then you can see, if you go in and you kind of bring back that saturation, if you've got the vignette here, bring it back in, and your photo is going to start to look a little bit better. And then the more that you practice this, the better you get, and eventually you're going to have a photo that ends up looking more like this and ends up looking a little bit more realistic and more like the actual scene that played out in front of you. And you know, that looks a lot more realistic and a lot better than an over-processed photo like this. You know, it's nice to see those big, bright, colorful colors, but in the end, this looks more realistic and ends up looking better, and is going to be a photo that is going to, you know, sell better and get more likes on social media because it doesn't look over edited. It looks like reality. You don't want a photo that doesn't look like reality because it's so over edited. So that's another mistake that I see a lot in beginners, is over editing. So be sure to tamper that back some and try not to over edit your photos. Be very mindful of that, and you know, look at before and afters, and you know, just really compare that and make sure that you're not over processing your photos. So that was the 5th mistake. And now the 6th and final mistake that I often see with beginners is thinking that every shoot is going to render shots. Just not the case with wildlife photography. Most of the time, shoots are not going to render shots. You know, a lot of beginners just think that, you know, every single time they go out, as they're starting out, they're going to get great photos, but that's just not the case. Most of the time, you're not going to get great photos. You know, for every 5 times you go out, you might have one good shoot. Maybe your ratio's lower than that. Maybe it's higher than that. But generally, the vast majority of the time, you're not going to get good photos. And it really takes persistence and patience and a lot of work to finally get that shoot where everything lines up, the lighting lines up, the setting that you're in lines up, the animal is cooperative, and you finally get good photos. It happens rarely, but when it does happen, it makes it all worth it. All the times that you went out and didn't get photos are worth it. So that is the 6th and final mistake. Not every shoot is going to render shots for you, but you have to accept that and be persistent about it, and eventually you are going to get good shots. So those are the 6 beginner mistakes that I often see that I think will ruin your wildlife photography. If you can fix those 6, then you're going to see vast improvements, and you're going to really start to develop great wildlife photos. So for those of you that are out there watching this video, I hope that you found these tips that I gave you in this video and the mistakes that I pointed out helpful, and I hope you're able to recognize if you're making these mistakes and apply the correct way to do it to your photos and hopefully improve your wildlife photography. That is pretty much it for this video, guys. If you have found this helpful, please drop a like down below and comment and let me know. And I want to say thank you all so much for watching. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. And with that, guys, please do not forget to check out my Instagram and my Facebook, which will be linked down below. And most importantly, as always, subscribe to be entered for the 1,000 subscriber Manatee Swim giveaway video. Thank you guys again for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.